In a forest reserve, which is usually quite empty, I was going around a bend when I noticed a car parked in the grass just outside the car park. I thought this was strange, but I continued walking. I must have been about 50 meters from the car when suddenly the boot opens and the car alarm goes off. The driver's side door also opens. I'm coming from the passenger side, and I can't see the driver, but I have a bad feeling about the situation. I keep walking along the trail, and when I go around it, I can see the side of the driver of the car. A man is sitting in the driver's seat and starts waving at me, raising his hand saying, "I'm not sure what's going on, but can you help me?" I tell him no, and that he's on his own. Without stopping my pace, and I continue walking, he raises his hands again, turns off the car. Alarm gets out and trunk gets into the car and drives away. I got goosebumps, so as soon as he was out of sight, I decided to turn back and walk in the opposite direction just to ensure my safety. I walked back through the fence. It took half an hour to get to the parking lot, where I had left my car. When I was approaching, the car alarm went off again. This scared me even more. But I didn't want to go back to the forest, so I continued towards the parking lot. When I got there, the same car was parked with the trunk, opened, the car alarm going off, and the driver's door opened. The guy was already talking to someone else in the parking lot. He sees me entering the parking lot. He looks at me for about a minute. He turns off the car alarm, closes the door bags, and leaves. I just ran to my car and called the Rangers, but they didn't believe there was anything strange. Percent sure that guy was trying to kidnap someone. This happened last summer when my husband's best friend flew from Rio de Janeiro to visit us in a rural area of São Paulo. My husband grew up in Rio de Janeiro, but I was raised here, and we decided to settle in this region. We wanted to provide our friend with the complete experience of a small and rural city. Something you don't what you notice when you come from the city is how completely dark it is out here, without street lights or urban lighting to illuminate the night. My husband had already commented on this when he moved here. There is a dense forest that covers several square kilometers on the outskirts of the city. A protected wildlife reserve. There are many legends about this forest. Will be haunted as it was the site of a bloody battle between native Brazilian tribes and is an indigenous cemetery. The old and scary stone amphitheater, Incunas, in the middle of the forest, are especially considered haunted. There is also a lake in the heart of the forest that locals call Dead Man's Lake because someone drowned there a few years ago, and the body was never found. I'm not sure if it was an accident or suicide, as I've seen many different versions of the story. I don't believe it in ghosts, and I'm not afraid of the dark or the forest, but my husband's friend does. This park technically closes at 10 p.m., but we decided to take a chance and took our friend to the forest at midnight on a moonless night we visited. The tower first never had seen at night, and the sight of the black silhouette against the starry sky surrounded by dead trees was unsettling and set the mood for the rest of the night. After a little persuasion, we managed to convince our friend to follow us to the tower by climbing the old spiral staircase. Creaking, we spent some time observing the surrounding landscape and enjoying the view of the starry sky from the top of the tower. The view was magnificent, and I thought it looked magical, but our friend seemed to get more and more nervous every second we walked down the long dirt track back to the car. But we kept hearing what sounded like footsteps coming from the trees on both sides and behind us. Our friend was scared, thinking it could be something paranormal, but I was worried about drug dealers or meth addicts, as there is a large population of suspicious people and frequent discoveries of meth labs in the area. My husband and I had our 9mm pistols strapped to our belts, but we didn't want to have to use them. So we picked up the pace back to the car and drove deeper into the woods, to the place where begins the trail to the old amphitheater. Our friend was really nervous now, as the trees were much denser in this part of the forest, and it was incredibly dark. We managed to convince him to follow us up the steep and rocky trail to the amphitheater. When we arrived, I noticed a tall structure in the center of the amphitheater that I had never seen before, but it was too dark to identify what it was. I was just using the light from my smartwatch to light the path so as not to spoil the frightening illusion created by the deep darkness of the forest with the beam of a flashlight. At this point, even my husband was getting uncomfortable and wanted to turn back, but I needed to know what the mixed object was and what had appeared in the last 2 days since my last walk in this part of the forest. With care, I descended to the center of the amphitheater and approached the structure with my husband and our friend following very closely. When I was a few meters from the object, I raised my wrist to illuminate it with the light of the clock, and I felt a sense of anguish and fear overcome me. Before me was a 10 m high wooden arch wrapped in red silk and adorned with animal bones and red roses. There was also a smaller object lower to the ground that I had not seen before, and it appeared to be some sort of stone altar. Suddenly, the stirring noises coming from the forest on all sides that I had previously attributed to animals or the wind seemed much louder. Threatening, my first thought was that it could be an evil cult or a group of Satanists waiting to sacrifice us to a demon, no matter how ridiculous it seemed at that moment. It seemed possible. The three of us jumped and turned towards the car when we heard a car door close and we saw the faint glow of the headlights filtering through the trees. We ran back down the trail, expecting to find some junkies trying to break into our car. We didn't know whether to be relieved or apprehensive when we saw Department of Natural Resources truck parked next to our car. The officer was searching the trees with his flashlight and greeted us asking what we were doing. We told him we were showing the area to our friend, and he informed us the park was closed. He noticed our firearms and asked for our documents and identifications, which we provided. He came back to the truck to check our information and came back minutes later with our $100 for being in the park. After closing time after that, we spent about 15 minutes chatting friendly with the officer when he asked what the amphitheater was like at night. I said it was really scary, and I described what we witnessed Officer Rio of the expressions of terror on our faces, and told us that a couple had rented an amphitheater for their wedding the next day and they had gone there today to decorate. It was a somewhat disappointing ending, and at first I was relieved but also disappointed. I planned to return to the forest on another dark night, but this time I will go alone and on foot so the Department of Natural Resources won't find me. This is the story of how my boyfriend decided he wasn't the outdoorsy adventurous type. Let's go back a little. My sweet boyfriend that he has went on a little camping trip with one of his close friends, Matt, after 2 successful days of camping and hiking, which he really enjoyed. He emphasized to me the importance of getting in touch with nature and exploring wildlife, something that I had never done before, and that didn't really interest me. Of course, parks are nice, but spending the nights outdoors in the wild nature was certainly not something that appealed to me. However, it persisted, and during the weekend of Valentine's Day, he organized everything. He borrowed the equipment from his friend, and we were going to spend the weekend in the middle of the woods. Honestly, our day didn't go as planned while we were going there. We ended up getting lost since it was an area with a very weak signal, and if you don't know the way, it's easy if you get lost. It took us about an extra hour until we finally found the right road, and it was already past noon at that point. We stopped in a small town, ate something, and finally headed towards our destination. It's worth mentioning that being February, it got dark quickly, and it was already starting to get dark when we arrived. My boyfriend, who had a rough idea of where the place was when he was there with his friend, insisted that we should follow the trail to get to this incredible place, a lovely place to wake up. We gathered all the equipment and walked in the twilight towards our destination. I tried to be optimistic for the sake of it, even though I wasn't having much fun so far, because walking in the dim light at that time, with only a flashlight to guide us, was not exactly my idea of fun. As we continued to walk, I inevitably got lost, and after about half an hour looking for the place he had planned, we decided to simply set up camp where we could find a good space, which didn't take long at that point. We didn't know where we were. We had strayed quite far from the trail in the hope of finding the place your friend had promised. And in the dark, although we didn't feel very well, we thought that with daylight we should be able to find our way back. We set up our tent with great difficulty, given the darkness and our only flashlight, and finally ate something before going to sleep. However, I found it difficult to pick up when sleeping. My boyfriend simply got comfortable inside the sleeping bag and passed out without any problems. However, for me, who had never been outside when I needed to sleep, I was always in the silence of my room, listening to everyone outside while I was trying to sleep. It was uncomfortable every time. When my boyfriend moved, there was a rustle of dry leaves on the floor. It bothered me a lot and made it difficult to find a comfortable position to sleep. So I lay awake looking into the darkness, hoping that sleep would eventually envelop me. I don't know how long it had been. Half conscious, waking up and sleeping at intervals, it seemed like any noise would wake me up. Suddenly, I clearly saw the sound of footsteps in the distance. My ears perked up, and I lay there listening, more awake than ever. There were people, but I couldn't see any flashlights, as they would easily be visible through the tent canvas. As I listened, I could hear 2 people talking. They seemed a little drunk, to be fair. One of them fell, and they were definitely getting closer to us. Suddenly saw what appeared to be the beam of a flashlight shining close to, but not directly at us. Tent, it was clear they had seen us as one of the men started whispering to the other. They continued talking, then quietly, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. I was pretty sure it was something related to ambushing our tent, or at least ransacking it. At that point, I was terrified. I felt a genuine fear like I had never felt before. There were people with bad intentions, and I was here in the dark, practically alone because my boyfriend was sleeping soundly. My only protection was a flashlight while these two men approached us without knowing what they were going to do or take. I really didn't want to find out. I looked around frantically, trying to make as little noise as possible. I had some way out. Defending myself, we hadn't brought anything in the form of pepper spray or a gun or knife. We decided to travel light, and as it was a very rural area, we thought nothing bad would happen, especially animals, since there are no dangerous animals. Where we live, humans were never part of the equation. What was our mistake? I grabbed my power bank, which was heavy, and probably the only thing that could hurt if it hit someone in the head, and I held it like a brick. I waited, moving silently towards the opening of the tent in case anyone stuck their head inside. I realized that if they shined the flashlight, they could see exactly where I was inside the tent, which worried me, but I thought that if that happened, I would lie down as quickly as possible in the hope of not being seen, and there I waited while the footsteps came closer and closer. In the stillness of the forest, the men finally arrived at the tent, whispering and walking around it slowly. Luckily, they didn't shine the flashlight into the tent, probably because they wanted to check if there was anyone inside and not wake that person up in case we were the ones posing danger. While I waited, anxiety and anticipation took over every neuron in my brain and every cell in my body, filling me with a primordial fear. Then they heard the sound of the zipper being slowly opened. I waited in the darkness, waiting for someone to stick their head out to check if we were there, and as soon as a lone head started to approach the zipper opening, they hit it with the power bank echo, or a creaking sound that I could never have imagined. I hit the man squarely in the nose with all the force my adrenaline-filled hand could muster. The scream that came out of him was more like a roar as he stepped back and started yelling for his friend to get out of there. I looked down at the power bank, and even though it was a moonless night and I could barely see anything, I could feel the blood on him, and I could almost smell the air. The men screamed and ran as if we had attacked them, and my boyfriend, obviously awake because of the noise, asked what hell it had happened. When he realized it had happened, we started taking down the tent and decided it was time to leave. As soon as we finished packing everything, it was still dark, and we used the flashlight to try and find our way back. But the problem still persisted. We had absolutely no idea where we were. We stood there in the dark, waiting, wondering what our next move would be. So in the clearing where we were, we moved close to some trees. We leaned our backs against them. We hid as much as possible, lying down on the grass, waiting for the sun to rise so we could leave quickly. As we waited in the darkness, we heard footsteps getting further and further away. We were worried they would come back, but they never did. When the first rays of the morning started to arrive, we looked around and started looking for the way back. Upon returning through the small clearing, we noticed a surprising amount of blood on the ground where our tent was, and a trail clear. I assumed these people, if they were walking through the forest in the middle of the night, they probably had some idea of where to go and follow a trail of blood. It was enough for them, and to paint the full picture, it was not an insignificant blood trail. The amount of blood on the ground was impressive. We finally found our way back to the main trail, and although we were tired, exhausted, dirty, we were finally on familiar ground. We walked for several hours until we got to our car, and then we drove as quickly as possible out of there without ever looking back. It was a weekend that changed my perspective and taught me the importance of taking precautions even in situations that seem safe. I never camped again since then, and believe me, I will never go again. This experience was enough for me.